Hey, what's up guys? This is Ramey Outdoors and welcome back to Fishing College. Today we're going to be talking about jigs and essentially any type of jig that you can walk into a big box store and find. So we're going to be talking about flipping jigs, football jigs, Ned rigs, chatterbaits or bladed jigs, and essentially any type of jig that you can go into a Walmart and find. So we're not going to be talking about a finesse jig or a punch jig because typically you're not going to go into a department store and find those. So this is going to be more for those people who are a little bit more casual with their jigs, not necessarily your tournament anglers, stuff like that. So I'm essentially going to be going over them and also teaching you in a how-to style video on how to actually properly fish them in a more practical manner. Remember to go ahead and like and subscribe, and let's get right to it. So the first one that we're going to be talking about today is going to be the structure jig or casting jig. And a lot of people end up kind of making them into their own type of category, but MLF or Major League Fishing categorizes them as one particular jig. So that is what I'm going to do today, the structure or casting jig. This is typically going to be characterized by a bulbous sloping head on either side, and it is going to have a very unique shape compared to other ones, which allows for it, once it actually hits, allows for it to stand up on the actual ground. So if this was in the water, these claws on this crawfish would be standing straight up. These are typically going to have a slightly thicker weed guard. Some people end up actually trimming them a little bit, as well as a bit of a thicker hook. This thicker hook is going to allow for you to get this into heavy cover without it being bent out. I'm mostly going to be throwing these around brush piles, sort of your heavy cover, skipping it under docks, as well as casting it out onto any kind of bottom structure that I can find out there, because it is effectively going to be a really great do-all jig. And because it is so great at doing so many amazing things, I'm going to have this tied on a very large portion of the year. And because it is so year-round based, you're also going to find a lot of anglers using these in ponds, lakes, rivers, and essentially anywhere that there's going to be fish. So next we're going to kind of talk about what kind of gear should you be throwing a structure or casting jig on. And this is mostly going to be, for a lot of these, I would kind of take some of these with a little bit of a grain of salt. And the main reason for that is because it very heavily depends on where you are fishing. For example, I'm fishing in the southeastern US. It's very hot. These fish get into very, very thick brush piles and deep under docks, and it's very easily to get broken off. So I'm going to have a little bit thicker line and a little bit of a heavier rod than say somewhere up north or out in the Midwest, where you guys might have a little bit more like laydowns, things like that. I'm not going to be suggesting everyone run X line and X rod. I'm mostly going to be giving a range. And for that range, I'm going to say about a 7 foot to 7'6" medium heavy or heavy, fast or extra fast. And somewhere in between about 40 to 65 pound line, braid, and anywhere between 15 to 20 pound fluorocarbon. Because this is going to be going into mostly your heavy cover situations, I wouldn't really recommend going any lower than that, but you definitely can depending on what kind of situation you are throwing your jig into. If you're going to be throwing it out into like a bowl type pond where there's no structure, do you need that thick of line? Absolutely not. There's absolutely no reason for you to be running line that thick. So use your head and understand where you are fishing definitely matters in your gear selection. This is just a typical range for your average pond. If you were to show up to any pond around the country and you use that gear, you will be completely fine. And you can always change from a braid to a fluorocarbon leader if absolutely necessary. Next, I'm going to go ahead and show you guys how I like to throw my casting or structure jigs. And this very much depends on where I'm going to be throwing these. I'm just going to go ahead and assume that there's some type of structure in front of you. So one of the first options is that you can pitch or flip these, and those are two technically different terms, but for the purpose of this video, we're just going to say that they're synonymous and you know the difference already. But I will be making a video on the actual difference. So let's go ahead and say that you have a short distance pitch right here, and you can go ahead and pitch it in there. And by this point, if you're throwing it into some kind of blowdown, you should be getting bit. If not, you can kind of lift your rod tip to give it a small bounce off the bottom, or you can give it kind of a bouncing hop to give it back onto the bottom, and then go ahead and reel in your slack. And that's going to be one of the main ways that I'm going to be throwing a casting or structure jig. The next is that I'm going to be making longer casts off into drop-offs or things like that. I can also go into flats. I can go off of like gradual slopes and those types of areas. But another way is that I'm going to gradually hop it back, or I can kind of take my rod at a canted angle and drag it along the bottom, which is going to allow for those soft plastics to do a lot of work and kick up a bunch of water. And then I can also go back and hop, 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 and then I can give it some pauses, let it sit there for a minute, let those bass inspect what they're looking at. Another one is I can gradually lift my rod and then reel in the slack and let it sit there. It's kind of like yo-yoing, but not really. It's just kind of a big hop into a pause. Does that make sense? There's a wide variety of ways that you can actually work a structure or casting jig, but these are going to be the main ones that I'm going to do. And now some of you are going to ask me, well, how do I hook set? So I like to keep a higher rod tip throughout this process, and then lower my rod tip, reel down, and give it a nice upward rising hook set. That's going to do a couple of things. First off, if that fish is in really heavy cover, it's going to automatically pull that fish up and out because I just took in a bunch of line. But also, because I'm pulling in all that slack and giving it an upward rising hook set, it is going to set that hook in the top of that fish's mouth, which is a really great place for it to stay pinned and also keep that fish on. So we're going to go ahead and start talking into our other types of jigs. Next, let's go ahead and talk about a very iconic jig that is going to really be named because of how our sports are played in America, and that is the football jig. Because if you were to take an American football, turn it sideways, hold it by its laces, that is what the head would look like. And it's actually made this way for a very specific reason. Because of this head, it is going to land completely vertically and then gently fall back. So it's very great to be dragged around in the mud and around to create a bunch of dust. So if I'm in open water or in any kind of area where there may not necessarily be as much structure, this is going to be great to throw, whether it's deep or shallow, 6 inches, 6 feet, 16 feet, 60 feet. I'm going to throw a football jig if conditions are right for it, because it is so great to drag and give gentle small hops across the bottom. It doesn't have quite as thick of a weed guard, and the actual gauge of the hook isn't quite as thick. So it's really easy to get a good, consistent hook set, which is really great for a lot of deep lakes and a lot of really, really nice open-bodied ponds. And especially around the summertime, where those bass might be a little bit deeper, this absolutely kills. And not really to sound like a bit of a broken record here, but as for the gear, it's typically going to be about a 7 foot to 7'6". You're going to kind of see that's a little bit of a common factor with some of these jigs. So 7 foot to 7'6", moderate fast, and anywhere between a 7.1 to 1 to an 8.1 to 1 gear ratio reel, and usually around 12 to 20 pound fluorocarbon. On this reel in particular, I'm running 17 pound fluorocarbon. That's just because I don't really throw in super heavy conditions, but they can sometimes be a little bit more heavy than not, if that makes any sense. So that's why I'm usually going to be throwing that 17 pound, and also the fact that we do have a lot of thick grass around in this area. That, and also throwing in with that 17 pound, I'm going to get a little bit more abrasion resistance and a little bit less stretch than usual. So next, we're going to go ahead and talk about the football jig. And I'm going to go ahead and show you guys how you should be working this. And again, going ahead and going in conjunction with the gear guide that I had earlier, you should be throwing these on fluorocarbon, and you can also be throwing these in deeper water. Now, you can be throwing these guys on braid, but personally, if you're going to be working in deeper water, a lot of the times people are going to be throwing football jigs in clearer water, which is why that fluorocarbon can be a little bit necessary. So let's go ahead and assume that there is a rocky patch offshore somewhere, and I'm casting at that. Somewhere where I know there's fish, and I'm casting at those fish. One of the first ways that I like to work my football jig is by dragging it across the bottom. Reel in my slack and let it sit. These can be little short drags, or they can be little longer drags. And this is going to kick up a lot of dust, and it's going to create a pretty big commotion. So another thing that you can also do is you can kind of twitch your rod tip a little bit, and that's going to create little small hops. And you can kind of combine those with the little drags and then little hops. And that's going to create little kind of dust patches, and it's going to create a lot of commotion for that bass to potentially be interested in. I'm not going to be throwing a football jig into super heavy cover, like into a blowdown typically, just because it's not necessarily designed for that. Remember, a football jig is going to be really amazing for being like it's a football, being dragged through the mud, drug around on gravel, and any kind of flat patches that you might find yourself in. Now, you can also make little short distance pitches right here if you know that there are fish existing in that area, because it can be really, really awesome to actually gradually finesse a fish with a football jig, just because it is such an amazing tool to use, especially if you know what you're doing. So, giving it little drags and trying to finesse that fish. Next, let's go ahead and talk about the flipping jig. And this is going to be characterized by a bulbous, greatly sloping head that is pretty rounded a lot at the bottom. And this is one of your more specialized jigs because it is so great for making little short distance flips and pitches, hence the name. I'm typically going to be throwing this in pretty heavy cover, so around very thick grass or around a really, really thick blowdown, maybe even skipping it up under a dock if I have to. And also, I'm not going to be keeping it there for very long. I'm gonna let it hit the bottom, hop, or even dragging it for a couple of seconds and then recasting, because this is such an intimate and very short distance technique. Once you hop it a couple of times, you're effectively back at the boat. It's a very pinpoint technique. This one in particular actually has a rattle trap on the back, so don't know if you guys can hear that, but it actually has BBs inside of it. So it does make a little bit of sound as well. For a flipping jig, I'm typically going to recommend a flipping setup. And that's going to be between a 7'6" to a 7'11", medium heavy or heavy, usually somewhere around in a 7.1 to 1 or higher gear ratio. I'm usually going to run an 8.3 to 1, but some people like it a little bit slower for that extra added torque. Also, I'm usually going to be running between 55 to 65 pound braid. I'm rarely, if ever, going to go to the fluorocarbon route whenever I'm using a flipping jig, but that's just me personally. Next, let's go ahead and talk about that flipping jig. And this is going ahead and assuming that I have a flipping setup, which I currently do not, because I did not bring one with me because I'm an idiot. But that aside, typically what I'm going to be doing with a flipping jig is, you guessed it, making little short distance accurate flips, usually only within a couple of meters. So I'm just going to hop, or even just give it short little drags, and then I am going to reel right back in, and I'm going to make a little flip somewhere else. And so it is going to be really great for making little short flips into very precise areas. Because of the way that it's actually built, it's going to fall to the bottom, and I can try and finesse those fish and then get right back out. So I can make little short finessey roll casts, I can make little flips and pitches. It's really great for those things. And because it is so great at that, it's something that I have an entire setup just completely built around, is making little flips. Now, I also use soft plastics, I punch with that setup, I do a lot of things with that setup. But one thing that I definitely don't do with a flipping jig is go boom and make a massive cast, because that is not what a flipping jig is technically supposed to do. Finger quotes, because you can do it, it's just not what it's designed to do. Now I gotta reel this in. Yeah, but even just being down there for just a few seconds, it got caked up in grass. So go ahead and clean that sucker off, and she is ready to go. Right back again. Next, let's go ahead and talk about the swim jig, which is going to be an amazing jig if there is any amount of grass in the area. So if there's grass, or even a little bit of wood or anything like that, throw a swim jig, especially if that grass is alive and there's a bunch of bait fish swimming around it. Characterized by a fish-like slender head, it is absolutely amazing to either yo-yo it, hop it along the bottom, drag it on the bottom, or just flat, slow retrieve or fast retrieve through the water column. It is an amazing jig with a lot of different ways that you can throw it. And trust me, during the spring or even during parts of the fall, I'm going to be throwing this. It is also typically going to have one of two things. It's either going to have a pretty flimsy, thin weed guard like this one does, or if it's a heavy cover swim jig, it's going to have a very thick weed guard. So, depending on what type of weed guard it has, you can either throw it the really thick cover, or maybe through slightly lighter cover. It just kind of depends on the type of swim jig you have. Again, to kind of sound a little bit like a broken record, 7 foot to 7'6", moderate to fast. Some people like to have a little bit more of a parabolic curve or ability to load their rod a little bit more with a swim jig. So some people like to have a moderate tip. I like to have a fast tip. Usually people are going to run a 7.1 to 1 gear ratio or faster, as well as braid that is thick enough to cut through those weeds. So typically around in that 55-pound braid range. And that is mostly because you're going to be throwing this around very, very thick grass that's almost always going to be rooted heavily in the ground. So if you get caught up in that grass and you're running super light braid, there's a very fair chance that you're going to snap off. All right, let's go ahead and talk about man's second best friend, the swim jig. And I'm saying second best friend because we all know dogs are man's best friend, and a girlfriend who will buy a man a bass boat is going to be the best friend. But this is going to be something that if I see grass, and wood, I am going to be throwing a swim jig. And this can be parallel to these grass lines, this can be over grass patches. Anywhere that I'm going to be seeing grass, I'm going to be throwing a swim jig. So let's go ahead and assume straight out there is a grass patch right here. And it is a above the ground or above the water line grass patch. So I'm going to cast parallel right off next to it because I know that there are going to be fish and bait fish going around and in that grass. So what I can do is I can hop and yo-yo off the bottom. So yo-yoing, lower your rod tip, pull up, reel in your slack. Pull up your rod tip, reel in your slack. Pull up your rod tip, reel in your slack. And you can do this fast, you can do this slow, you can do this for a short raise, you can do it for a high raise. It generally just kind of depends on what kind of situation you're in. Another thing that you can do, so let's go ahead and get another cast right parallel to that grass, is that you can kind of pop it as you're reeling, and that's going to flare that skirt out. Similar to like Marilyn Monroe walking over a sewer grate, is you can kind of pop it and flare that skirt. And you can do this repeatedly, you can do it periodically. It doesn't really matter. And last but not least, you can do what a lot of people do is they just cast and they just kind of reel in at a gradual pace, or they kind of get a nice, consistent, moderate to fast pace in, keeping it high in the water column and kind of looking like a very fast moving bait fish. So you can either throw it parallel to that grass line, or you can throw it on top of that grass line, which is what a lot of people will do if it is a subsurface grass line. So say you have the top of the water right here, and then you have the top of the grass just below that surface, maybe a foot or so above it. That's what a subsurface grass line is going to be. And a lot of people are going to be throwing swim jigs and bladed jigs on top of those because it is absolutely phenomenal for catching those fish. But let's go ahead and move on to the next one. Let's talk about one of the bad boys in the fishing world, the bladed jig or the chatterbait. This is going to be mostly characterized by still having that jig head, but also having a blade that is attached as well. And it's typically going to have that tie-on point right there. And a big question that I get a lot is, where do you tie on from? So you can actually kind of see where my line is tied on right there. And that's usually where a lot of jigs are going to have their tie-on point, is right there, right at the end of this little point. And that's going to be commonplace. Googan's a little bit different with some of their chatterbaits or their clickbaits, but for the most part, that is where you are going to tie on your chatterbait or bladed jig across a very large amount of brands, like your slobber knocker, your chatterbait, your jackhammer, your big blade, your thunder cricket. They're all going to have that similar tie-on point. These are going to be absolutely amazing for any kind of grass lines, throwing under cover. Essentially, if you can throw it, you can throw a bladed jig. You can yo-yo it, you can drag it on bottom, you can pop it to make that skirt pulse. You can slow retrieve it. You can essentially throw a chatterbait wherever you want to. And it is a fantastic bait to do so. If you don't have a chatterbait, I would highly suggest picking one up. So as for gear, I'm usually going to be recommending a 7'3" to 7'11" medium heavy or heavy glass cranking rod, usually leaning towards that medium heavy side. And this kind of depends on what type of fishing you're actually doing. If you're doing long range pitches and a lot of really thick, heavy stuff, usually that 7'11" is going to be really great. But if you're mostly doing a lot of short range roll casts, that shorter rod is going to come a lot in handy. As for gear ratios, I'm usually going to be running between a 6.1 to 1 or a 7.1 to 1, somewhere in that range, just because it is very easy to get to where you're reeling too fast with a chatterbait and it's going to come all the way up to the surface, which in some instances might be a good thing. However, having that be the status quo while maintaining reeling pressure might not be the best thing. So that's why I'm recommending that slower gear ratio. As for line, it very much depends on conditions, so between 12-pound all the way up to 17-pound fluorocarbon is a really great place to start. However, some people also run 30 to 50-pound braid, and sometimes running into a braid to fluorocarbon leader. All right, so let's go ahead and get this bladed jig and chatterbait out on the water so I can show you how to do it. So typically I'm going to be throwing some kind of rod that has a good solid parabolic curve. So you can see this is a medium heavy moderate, so it's got a pretty whippy tip to it, which is going to allow for it to bend pretty easily. But I'm also going to be working with a 6.2 to 1 gear ratio, so a relatively slow or moderate gear ratio. So let's go ahead and make a longer cast out there, and we're just going to go ahead and start with that slow, moderate retrieve, which is going to push it like pretty low in the water column, which is what I'm going to do 90% of the time. What you can also do is you can give it little pops as well, similar to a swim jig. Something you're also going to see is that there's going to be a lot of overlap between the swim jig and the bladed jig. And that's because they're retrieved pretty similarly, except the bladed jig is going to, generally speaking, be a lot slower of a retrieve. Because if you retrieve it too fast, then the blade's not going to have time to work and it's not going to impart any action. So you can go ahead and throw your bladed jig back out there, and you can go back to yo-yoing. So you can raise that rod tip, reel your slack in, raise your rod tip, reel that slack in, mix, rinse, and repeat. You can pop it. You can just slow reel it. You can give it pauses. You can drag it on the bottom. Now, I don't really recommend dragging it on the bottom too much if you have a lot of grass in the area. Mostly if you have a silt bottom, this can be really great to kick up a bunch of dirt. But I'm also going to be throwing these in a lot of flats, grass lines, and generally speaking, if you can throw it, a chatterbait is never a bad option. Last but not least, let's go ahead and talk about our smallest jig, the Ned rig. And this is typically going to be characterized by having either a ball head or mushroom head jig head rammed through a soft plastic. The Ned rig is also an amazing lure for basically doing nothing. Essentially, how you're going to work this is you're going to give it small hops or drags and essentially let the bait work itself. You can sometimes wiggle it and shake it around or give it bigger hops to impart more action. But for the most part, the most things that people do wrong with this is trying to do too much with it. So it is a super finessey bait. And it's really amazing for getting a super subtle bite when the bite is really harsh. You can also form up your soft plastics to kind of match around what is being thrown in the water. So if you have a lot of bugs that happen to look like this can be a really great way to get bites, especially when it's a hard bite. Now, as for gear, this is going to be something that I am essentially going to say either throw this on BFS or on a spinning setup. And that's going to be between a 7-foot to 7'6" medium or medium light spinning gear, 2,000 to 4,000 spinning reel, and usually going to be running a 10-pound to 30-pound braided line main line, all the way down to a 6 to 12-pound fluorocarbon line. And this really depends on what kind of situation you're actually running in, but the vast majority of people are going to use a braided main line with a fluorocarbon leader. And that is so that you can get the sensitivity of your braid and also the visibility of the braid while still getting the stretch and also getting the invisibility factors of fluorocarbon, which can be a really big advantage for fishing in super clear water. The Ned rig, one thing that a lot of people typically get wrong with the Ned rig is they try to overcomplicate it. They try to do too much with it. So I'm gonna show you guys how I like to work my Ned rigs. So I'm gonna go ahead and make that long cast, and this can be a little short, little flip. It can be a longer cast. It can be anything. And I am going to wait to close my bail until I know it is at the bottom. And once it is at the bottom, I can give it short little twitches of my rod tips, or what I can do is I can give it a little bit of a gradual raise of my rod tip, which can be a really great option, having those slow raises. And then I will typically give it a little pause and let any fish that want to inspect it, they can inspect it. And then I can get back to giving it little twitches and then giving a little bit of a bigger hop and then letting it sit for a second so I know it's back on bottom. Something that's also really important with any kind of Ned rig is understanding how to utilize your drag system. It is a very thin hook, and so it's very easy for them to be bent out, which can be a little bit of a problem for some inexperienced anglers. They don't know how to utilize their drag system. They might have it too tight, which will bend out the hooks, or they'll snap their leader. Oh, I'm getting hit. I just got hit by something. Gave me a little, and it didn't take it. But how a lot of anglers will end up having it, they'll either have it cranked all the way down and you can't pull any line out, or what they'll do is they'll have it too loose, and as soon as they set the hook, it yanks straight out and they don't get a hook set, but instead they just get a bite, they kind of scratch the fish's mouth, and they lose a potential fish. So you want it in that fine line where that fish can still run and fight, but whenever you set that hook, it's not going to just pull a bunch of line out. So to kind of rebut on the Ned rig, make sure that you leave your bail open until it hits the bottom, otherwise it's going to pendulum back towards you. Close your bail, reel in that slack that you might have, and just kind of give it a couple of little twitches on the bottom, or you can give it little drags on the bottom. So there's a wide variety of things that you can do. Sometimes I will also I'll take my fingers, make a little scissor, and I'll just kind of bounce my rod tip. Sometimes that encourages a bite. You can kind of mix it up a little bit, but keep your movements small, not any kind of crazy bounces all over the place. You don't need to be bouncing it like a Texas rig all the way up to the surface and bounding it out. That's too much for a Ned rig, and it doesn't make any sense for such a finesse-heavy lure. So now that we've kind of gone over all of these lures here, let's go ahead and talk about some of the fine pieces of jigs and things like trailers, lead versus tungsten, stuff like that. So let's go ahead and get into it. A big problem that I see a lot of beginner anglers kind of struggling with is the difference between lead and tungsten. And for some of you, this might be a very easy choice because of EPA guidelines. Go ahead and check out your state's guidelines on whether or not you can use lead in your waters. So if it's illegal to use, you already have your answer, go with tungsten. But for some of you, like me, I live in North Carolina, where no such guidelines exist. So there's a little bit of a debate between lead and tungsten. So let's talk about that. So first off, tungsten is a lot more expensive than lead. That's going to be the first big thing here. It's also going to be that tungsten is a much smaller and more dense form factor, which thus is going to make it fall a little bit faster. So some of y'all are probably like, oh, it's the same weight, 3/4 ounce is 3/4 ounce. Well, that's just because there's less water resistance being pushed on it, so it's going to fall throughout that water column a little bit more easily because it has less forces acting on it. Because it is also a more conductive metal, tungsten is also going to be more sensitive. So if you have a very sensitive bottom or things like that with a bunch of bumps and things like that, it's going to be able to transmit that little bump or that bite much more easily, which is going to be a really big advantage for you whenever you have little nipping bites or fish that aren't necessarily eating as well. So you know to give that fish more time to eat. And last but not least, kind of to rebut on the whole EPA thing, tungsten is non-toxic and lead is. I'm not going to get into the chemistry of it because that's not my area, but go ahead and do your research on it. But there's a reason that we don't use lead in our paint anymore. If you need to know why, there might be a reason that your grandpa's a jerk because he lived through a time where we had lead in our paint. As well as asbestos and other things, but nah, who needs to care about that, right? Another big thing that I do get some questions on is whether or not you should be using a trailer. And what that is that is going to be the soft plastic that is at the end of a jig that I thread on myself. So it's going to look kind of like this little soft plastic crawfish right there. That is what is called a trailer. And what trailers are used for is that is going to increase the actual size of the lure, it's going to increase the disturbance and the drawing power of that lure. And all drawing power means is basically a lure's ability to draw a fish in from any amount of distance to actually look at it and inspect it. And typically this is going to be lures like glide baits, chatterbaits, stuff like that. Stuff that puts off a lot of vibration and presence in the water. So the more presence a lure has, the more drawing power it's going to have. Because of this increased drawing power, this is usually going to make it more appealing sometimes for a fish to actually bite it. But also sometimes it could be that it's imitating a forage that might be in the water. For example, this is a crawfish. So if there's a lot of crawfish in this pond, it might be great to use a crawfish type trailer. Whereas if there's a lot of bait fish, I'm going to be throwing more of a paddle tail on my chatterbait versus a crawfish. But sometimes it may not necessarily make as much of a difference, but a lot of the times when those fish get a really good look at it, like in clear water or in slightly stained water, it can make a pretty big difference. Well, I really hope that helps you guys. I know this has been a little bit more of a long form video. I don't know how long it ends up being after editing, but I know it's a little bit longer than my usual type of content. But I really wanted to kind of take a little bit of time to really teach you guys how to work these different types of jigs, especially in a very easy to understand format like Fishing College. And you guys can kind of understand how long I've been out here because you guys can kind of see the sweat shadow that has formed on my shirt. It is somewhere around 90 degrees here in North Carolina as this is being filmed. Also, I'm just kind of a sweaty guy, as you guys can see in some of my videos. But I really hope that helps. Remember to go ahead and like and subscribe. And as per usual, have fun catching fish, people. Peace.